A Christian army was sent to save a Christian empire. A century later, a Christian army destroyed that same empire completely. If that sounds like a contradiction, that's because it is, and it sits at the center of one of the most misunderstood chapters in world history. The Crusades are remembered today as a single, unified holy war. Centuries of religious fanaticism pointed in one direction. The reality is stranger, messier, and far more revealing about how power actually works than almost anyone learns in school. To understand how the Crusades actually began, you have to start not with religious zeal, but with a desperate letter. In 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert, the Byzantine Empire suffered one of the most catastrophic military defeats in its long history, losing vast territories in Anatolia to the invading Seljuk Turks. For the next 2 decades, the empire that had once stretched across the eastern Mediterranean watched its heartland shrink dramatically, its emperor increasingly desperate for outside help. In 1095, Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos sent envoys to Pope Urban II, requesting military assistance, specifically mercenary soldiers to help reclaim lost Byzantine territory from the Turks. This is the detail almost universally left out of the popular narrative. The First Crusade did not begin as a unilateral European invasion of the Middle East. It began as a response to a direct plea for help from a Christian emperor whose empire was collapsing. Pope Urban II, however, transformed that request into something far larger and far more consequential than Alexios likely intended. At the Council of Clermont in November 1095, Urban delivered a speech calling not just for mercenaries to assist Byzantium, but for a full-scale holy expedition to reclaim Jerusalem itself from Muslim control, promising participants remission of sins for their service. The response was overwhelming, arguably far beyond what Urban himself anticipated. Tens of thousands of knights, nobles, and ordinary peasants took up the cross and began marching east. But historians studying Urban's motivations closely point to something rarely acknowledged. His call to crusade wasn't driven purely by religious conviction. It also served 2 very practical political goals. First, the Great Schism of 1054 had formally split Christianity into Western Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches, and a successful joint military campaign offered Urban a potential path toward healing that rift and asserting papal authority over a reunified Christendom. Second, and perhaps more significantly, medieval Europe in the late 11th century was plagued by endemic violence among its own feudal nobility. Minor lords and knights constantly warring over land and honor in conflicts the Church had struggled for decades to contain through initiatives like the Peace of God movement. Redirecting that violent energy toward a distant external enemy, framed as righteous holy war, offered Urban a way to export Europe's internal chaos, rather than continue trying, unsuccessfully, to suppress it at home. What happened next reveals just how little central control existed over the movement Urban had unleashed. Before the organized armies of European nobility had even finished assembling, a charismatic and largely uncontrolled preacher named Peter the Hermit led a massive, poorly equipped, poorly trained group of commoners. Historians now call it the People's Crusade, eastward toward Constantinople, arriving months ahead of the official military forces. This wasn't a disciplined army. It was tens of thousands of peasants, minor knights, and opportunists, many with little to no military training, marching with minimal supplies and even less strategic planning. Along the way through Hungary and the Balkans, clashes over food and looting turned violent repeatedly. When this ragtag force finally crossed into Seljuk-controlled Anatolia in the autumn of 1096, they were almost completely annihilated at the Battle of Civitate, ambushed by organized Turkish forces who faced little real resistance from an army that was, in any meaningful military sense, barely an army at all. This catastrophic and almost entirely forgotten prelude rarely appears in popular retellings, yet it reveals something crucial, that the crusading movement from its very earliest moments was chaotic, decentralized, and driven as much by religious hysteria and economic desperation among Europe's poor as by any coordinated military or political strategy. There is an even darker chapter connected to this same period, one that modern historians consider essential to any honest account of the Crusades, and one that rarely appears in simplified retellings at all. As bands of crusaders, both common and noble, moved through the Rhineland region of Germany in the spring and summer of 1096, on their way toward the Holy Land, some groups turned their violence against a target much closer to home, the region's ancient and established Jewish communities. In cities including Worms, Mainz, and Cologne, crusader mobs, sometimes led by minor nobles like Count Emicho, massacred thousands of Jewish men, women, and children, framing the violence as an extension of the same holy war rhetoric being used against Muslims in the East. Local bishops in several cities attempted with limited and inconsistent success to shelter Jewish communities from the violence. These massacres, now referred to by historians as the Rhineland massacres, demonstrate something the popular Crusades as holy war against Islam framing entirely obscures, that the religious violence unleashed by the crusading movement was never neatly directed at a single external enemy. It was a broader eruption of religiously justified violence that also devastated communities within Europe itself, long before the crusading armies ever reached the Holy Land. The main crusading armies, meanwhile, composed largely of experienced Norman, French, and other European nobility, proved far more militarily effective than the doomed People's Crusade had been. After a grueling multi-year campaign marked by brutal sieges, including the prolonged siege of Antioch in 1097 and 1098, the surviving Crusader forces finally reached Jerusalem in June 1099. The siege that followed lasted just over a month, and when the city finally fell on July 15, 1099, what followed was a massacre of the civilian population, described in graphic and disturbing detail by both Christian and Arab chroniclers of the period. Contemporary accounts describe streets running with blood, the deaths of thousands of Muslim and Jewish residents, including those who had sought shelter in the city's mosques and synagogue. Modern historians actively debate the precise scale of the killing. Medieval chroniclers on all sides were prone to exaggeration for rhetorical effect, but there is broad scholarly consensus that the fall of Jerusalem involved a large-scale massacre of its civilian population, an event that would shape Muslim memory of the Crusades for centuries and remains, to this day, one of the most historically significant atrocities of the entire medieval period. A kingdom the Crusaders established in Jerusalem lasted for nearly a century, and the following decades were far more complex and far less purely antagonistic than the simple framing of perpetual holy war suggests. Contrary to popular imagination, Crusader states in the Levant frequently formed pragmatic alliances, trade agreements, and even military partnerships with neighboring Muslim states, driven not by shared faith but by shared political interest, exactly the kind of realpolitik that existed throughout medieval politics everywhere else in the world. Trade continued across religious lines throughout much of the Crusader period, and local populations, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish alike, often lived under Crusader rule in conditions of uneasy but functional coexistence, far removed from the image of constant, unrelenting religious warfare. This complexity becomes especially visible in one of the most famous chapters of the entire crusading era, the conflict between Saladin, the Kurdish Muslim leader, who reunified Egypt and Syria and eventually recaptured Jerusalem in 1187, and King Richard I of England, known to history as Richard the Lionheart, during the Third Crusade. What's remarkable, and what modern historians frequently highlight as evidence against the simple clash of civilizations narrative, is how Saladin was actually portrayed in medieval European chronicles written by his own enemies. Christian writers of the period, including chroniclers directly connected to Richard's own court, repeatedly praised Saladin's chivalry, generosity, and honorable conduct in war, describing him in terms typically reserved for celebrated Christian knights. According to multiple historical accounts, when Richard fell seriously ill during the campaign, Saladin sent his own personal physician to attend to him, and when Richard's horse was killed in battle, Saladin reportedly sent him 2 replacement war horses. Extraordinary gestures between supposedly implacable religious enemies. The Third Crusade itself, after years of brutal fighting, including the infamous siege of Acre, ultimately ended not in total military victory for either side, but in a negotiated settlement, the Treaty of Jaffa in 1192, which left Jerusalem under Muslim control while guaranteeing unarmed Christian pilgrims safe access to the city's holy sites. This pragmatic, negotiated ending, a compromise reached through diplomacy rather than total conquest, sits awkwardly alongside the popular image of the Crusades as an uncompromising religious war fought to total victory or total defeat. Nowhere is the gap between popular memory and historical reality more dramatic, however, than in the events of the Fourth Crusade, launched in 1202 with the stated goal of recapturing Jerusalem by first striking at Muslim-controlled Egypt. Almost nothing about the Fourth Crusade went according to that original plan. Unable to pay the enormous sum owed Venice for the ships needed to transport their army, the crusading force found itself effectively indentured to Venetian commercial and political interests. Venice redirected the Crusader army first toward the Christian city of Zara on the Adriatic coast, a commercial rival of Venice, which the Crusaders besieged and captured despite explicit papal prohibition against attacking fellow Christians, resulting in Pope Innocent III excommunicating the entire crusading army. Then drawn into a succession dispute within the Byzantine imperial family itself, the Crusader army was persuaded to sail to Constantinople to help restore a deposed claimant to the Byzantine throne, in exchange for promises of enormous financial payment and military support for the eventual campaign against Jerusalem. What followed is widely considered by historians to be one of the most stunning ironies in medieval history. After successfully restoring the Byzantine claimant to power, The new emperor proved unable to fulfill the massive financial promises he had made to the Crusaders. Tensions escalated, political chaos engulfed Constantinople, and in April 1204, the Crusader army, the descendants in spirit of the very movement launched over a century earlier explicitly to help defend the Byzantine Empire, turned their weapons directly against Constantinople itself. The city, the largest and wealthiest Christian metropolis in the world at the time, home to the most sacred relics and treasures in Christendom, was brutally sacked by its supposed Christian allies. Historians describe days of systematic looting, destruction, and violence, with countless irreplaceable artistic, religious, and literary treasures either destroyed or carried off to Western Europe. The Byzantine Empire, already weakened for over a century, never fully recovered from this catastrophic blow, and many historians argue this self-inflicted wound, delivered not by Muslim forces, but by fellow Christians ostensibly marching under the same crusading banner that began with Alexius's original plea for help, fatally weakened Byzantium's ability to resist the eventual Ottoman conquest that would finally end the empire in 1453. Consider the full arc of that irony for a moment. A movement launched in 1095 specifically because a Byzantine emperor begged Western Christendom for military assistance against an external threat concluded, just over a century later, with the Western Christian army systematically destroying the very empire that plea had been meant to save. The Crusades did not maintain a single consistent purpose or target across their 2 centuries of history. They evolved, fractured, and were repeatedly redirected by immediate political and financial pressures that had little or nothing to do with the original religious justification that had launched the movement in the first place. So what does the popular version of the Crusades get wrong? Not that religious conviction played a genuine role, it clearly did, for countless participants across 2 centuries of crusading history. But the popular narrative, whether framed as heroic Christian holy war or as simple unprovoked Western aggression, both flatten an extraordinarily complicated, multi-generational series of political, economic, and religious conflicts into a single, clean storyline that never actually existed. The reality historians study is one of shifting alliances that crossed religious lines constantly, massacres directed not just at external religious enemies but at vulnerable communities within Europe itself, chivalric respect extended between supposed mortal enemies, negotiated diplomatic settlements rather than total religious victories, and finally, a movement so thoroughly redirected by financial debt and political opportunism that it eventually turned its full military force against the very Christian empire it had originally been created to defend. There's a broader historical pattern worth sitting with here, one that extends well beyond the specific history of the Crusades themselves. Movements that begin with a clearly stated singular purpose rarely remain confined to that purpose once large numbers of people, competing political interests, and significant financial stakes become involved. Religious language and justification, once unleashed as a mobilizing force, frequently proves impossible to fully control, capable of being redirected toward targets and toward outcomes that the original architects of the movement never intended and likely never would have sanctioned. The Crusades remind us that historical movements are rarely driven by a single motive acting in isolation. They are almost always propelled by a complicated, often contradictory mixture of genuine faith, political ambition, economic necessity, and the simple, unpredictable momentum of large groups of people once they are set into motion. Perhaps that is the truest and most uncomfortable lesson buried within 2 centuries of crusading history. A cause that begins as a rescue mission can end generations later as an act of destruction against the very thing it once set out to save, not because anyone necessarily planned it that way from the beginning, but because once immense religious and political forces are unleashed into the world, they rarely stay contained within the boundaries their original architects imagined for them.